August 7th, 1942. In the skies over Guadalcanal, Imperial Japanese Navy ace Saburo Sakai takes a .30 caliber machine gun round directly to the skull. Shards of metal blind his right eye, and the massive trauma instantly paralyzes the entire left side of his body. Blood obscures his remaining vision as his shattered A6M Zero drops into an uncontrolled dive toward the Pacific. He is over 500 miles away from his airstrip in Rabaul. Medically and statistically, Sakai is already a dead man. The human body cannot sustain this level of catastrophic damage, let alone command a crippled aircraft across hundreds of miles of open ocean. What happens next is one of the most astonishing feats of survival and dead-reckoning navigation in the history of military aviation. We are going to break down exactly how a critically wounded pilot drifting in and out of consciousness managed to coax a shattered aircraft across hundreds of miles of featureless ocean. But the incredible 4-hour flight of Saburo Sakai is only half of the narrative. The events of that afternoon sparked a decades-long historical detective investigation that continues to divide researchers today. The central mystery revolves around a single, fateful burst of gunfire. Who actually pulled the trigger? For decades, post-war mythology and celebrated memoirs confidently named the specific American rear gunner responsible. This narrative even culminated in a highly publicized emotional reunion between the two former enemies long after the guns fell silent. However, when we strip away the sentiment and meticulously cross-reference the original, declassified combat logs from both sides, the accepted legend begins to fracture. We are going to separate enduring wartime myth from the cold, documented reality of that chaotic engagement, to uncover the truth behind the man who shot Saburo Sakai, and to understand how a famous post-war reconciliation might be rooted in a complicated case of mistaken identity. We must first look at the crushing, high-stakes tactical reality that pushed both forces into the unforgiving skies over Guadalcanal in the summer of 1942. By the first week of August 1942, the strategic geometry of the Pacific War is violently compressing. The Japanese Empire had expanded outward with terrifying speed in the months following Pearl Harbor, establishing a massive, heavily fortified base of operations at Rabaul on the island of New Britain. But when American Marines unexpectedly weighed ashore on the beaches of Guadalcanal on the morning of August 7th, they effectively cross a geopolitical red line. Guadalcanal sits at the absolute extreme edge of Japanese land-based air projection. To defend the island and strike back at the American invasion fleet, the Imperial Japanese Navy is forced to launch immediate counterattacks from Rabaul. This is not a short tactical hop. It is a staggering 560-mile journey each way. Just flying to the target and returning requires covering more than 1,100 miles of featureless open water. For the fighter pilots tasked with securing the airspace and escorting the bombers, this represents a logistical and physiological nightmare without precedent in aerial warfare. It means sitting strapped tightly into a cramped, unpressurized cockpit for up to 7 continuous hours. There is no radar to guide them home. There is no navigational safety net, no radio beacons, and no friendly airstrips along the route. There are only dead-reckoning mathematics, a magnetic compass, and a vast ocean that will swallow any pilot who miscalculates his fuel burn by even a fraction of a percent. By the time a Japanese pilot reaches the airspace over the Solomon Islands, he has already been flying for 3 grueling hours. The physical toll is immense. At altitude, the temperatures are freezing, yet the pilots sweat under heavy flight suits. The deafening, relentless roar of the radial engine batters their hearing, and the constant, high-frequency vibration of the airframe seeps deep into their muscles. Their focus is inherently degraded, their reflexes dulled by fatigue before a single shot is even fired. Every second spent over the target area burns precious aviation gas that is desperately needed for the long flight home. They are fighting on a stopwatch, operating with absolute zero fuel margins. Yet the men flying these punishing missions are not ordinary aviators. They belong to the Tainan Kokutai, the Tainan Air Group, universally regarded as the most elite fighter unit in the Imperial Japanese Navy. And at the sharp end of this spear is 26-year-old Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai. By the summer of 1942, Sakai is already a hardened combat veteran with years of ruthless experience over China, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. He is a predator at the absolute top of the food chain, flying the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. The Zero is an engineering marvel, a machine designed specifically to conquer the vast distances of the Pacific. To achieve its unprecedented range and legendary maneuverability, its Japanese designers made a brutal, calculated trade-off. They completely eliminated armor plating for the pilot and stripped out the heavy, self-sealing rubber bladders normally used to protect aviation fuel tanks. It is a glass cannon. In the hands of a master tactician like Sakai, the Zero is a phantom, virtually untouchable in a classic turning dogfight. The doctrine of the Tainan Air Group relies heavily on this mechanical agility and their own aggressive, hyper-refined flying skills to dismantle Allied fighter formations. They have spent the first year of the war effortlessly shredding slower, heavier Allied aircraft. They expect to dictate the terms of engagement over Guadalcanal in exactly the same way. But the tactical environment of the Pacific is rapidly shifting. The Americans have learned bitter, bloody lessons from their early defeats. The aircraft waiting for the Japanese over the Solomon Islands are not the obsolete, unarmored targets of 1941. The United States Navy is deploying robust, carrier-based strike aircraft, specifically the Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber and the newly introduced Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bomber. These American planes are fundamentally different from the nimble, fragile Japanese fighters. They are heavy, rugged, and built to absorb immense mechanical punishment and keep flying. More importantly, American aviation doctrine has rapidly adapted to the lethal dominance of the Zero. Knowing they cannot outturn or outclimb the Japanese, American carrier strike groups rely on tight, disciplined defensive formations, and these bombers have teeth. The rear cockpits are manned by dedicated aviation radiomen and gunners, wielding flexible, twin-mounted 30 caliber or single 50 caliber heavy machine guns. Instead of breaking formation and trying to run from a pursuing Zero, which would be a death sentence, American bomber crews are trained to hold their course, overlap their fields of fire, and create a lethal, concentrated wall of lead that any attacking fighter must fly directly through. This tactical shift creates a deadly new dynamic in the skies over the Pacific. The Japanese pilots, flying their highly flammable, unarmored aircraft, are accustomed to engaging single-seat fighters like the Wildcat, where the lethal threat only comes from the front propeller hub. But when attacking a formation of American carrier bombers from the rear quarter, a pursuing Zero is flying straight into focused, synchronized machine gun fire. When Saburo Sakai and the veterans of the Tainan Air Group drop out of the clouds over Guadalcanal on that sweltering August afternoon, they are stepping into a tactical meat grinder while operating at the absolute limit of human endurance. They have crossed hundreds of miles of ocean. Their fuel gauges are already dictating a strict countdown, and their minds are burdened by the sheer physiological exhaustion of the transit. In this chaotic, high-speed arena, visual identification must happen in a fraction of a second. A pilot whose judgment is clouded by hours of fatigue might look at a silhouette against the glaring Pacific sun, misread the shape of the tail or the thickness of the fuselage, and realize his fatal mistake only when a sudden wall of incendiary tracer fire tears through the thin aluminum of his cockpit. That exact, fatal scenario of mistaken identity became a brutal reality for Saburo Sakai on the afternoon of August 7th. High above the chaotic airspace of the Solomon Islands, Sakai spotted a cluster of 8 aircraft cruising in a tight defensive circle below him. The silhouettes were distant, framed against the intense glare of the Pacific sun and the hazy backdrop of the ocean. Operating under the grinding fatigue of his long transit from Rabaul, Sakai processed the visual information in a split second. He identified the formation as a group of Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters. It was a calculated, aggressive assumption. A Wildcat was a single-seat aircraft, and its only weapons pointed strictly forward. If a seasoned pilot could slip behind one, the American fighter was effectively defenseless from the rear. Acting on years of instinct and strict Tainan Air Group doctrine, Sakai pushed his throttle forward. He rolled his Mitsubishi Zero into a steep, diving pursuit, lining up for a textbook rear ambush. He closed the distance with terrifying speed, slipping smoothly into what he believed was the formation's ultimate blind spot. His hand gripped the control stick, waiting for the targets to fill his illuminated optical gun sight. But as the gap narrowed, 500 yards, 300, 200, the shapes of the American aircraft began to resolve with horrifying clarity. The wingspans were too broad. The greenhouse canopies stretched much too far down the fuselage. In a freezing moment of realization, Sakai understood his catastrophic error. These were not single-seat fighters. They were robust, carrier-based bombers, and he had just flown his unarmored, highly flammable aircraft directly into their concentrated kill zone. Instead of stalking defenseless tail sections, Sakai was now staring straight down the barrels of multiple heavy machine guns. The American rear gunners had tracked his diving approach the entire time. Exercising strict fire discipline, they held their triggers, letting the Japanese ace close to point-blank range to guarantee their overlapping fields of fire. At less than 100 yards, the trap snapped shut. The rear gunners unleashed a synchronized, devastating volley. A concentrated wall of armor-piercing and incendiary lead slammed into the Zero. Sakai had no time to break away, no time to utilize the famous maneuverability of his aircraft. A heavy round smashed directly into the frontal aviation glass of his cockpit. The immense kinetic energy shattered the reinforced canopy frame, driving a spray of jagged glass and deformed metal straight into Sakai's face. The debris tore into his right eye and violently impacted his skull. The physical trauma was instantaneous. A massive shockwave surged through his central nervous system, abruptly severing his motor functions. The undisputed apex predator of the Pacific skies was instantly reduced to a helpless passenger. The entire left side of his body went completely paralyzed. He could not grip the throttle. He could not pull back on the control stick. Stripped of his sight, his mobility, and his defenses, Sakai was trapped inside a shattered, howling cockpit as his crippled Zero snapped over and entered a steep, uncontrolled plunge toward the dark waters of the Pacific. The terminal velocity of a dying aircraft has a distinct, terrifying acoustic signature. As the shattered Mitsubishi Zero plummets toward the surface of the Pacific Ocean, the slipstream violently tears through the blown-out canopy framing, creating a deafening, high-pitched scream. The 14-cylinder Nakajima radial engine, no longer restrained by level flight, begins to overspeed, howling as gravity accelerates the unarmored fighter into a catastrophic dive. Inside the cockpit, Saburo Sakai is trapped in a terrifying neurological void. The kinetic impact of the .30 caliber round has effectively short-circuited his central nervous system. The entire left side of his body is dead weight. He cannot feel the throttle quadrant. He cannot move his left leg to apply rudder pressure. He is blind in his right eye, and a profound, paralyzing shock has severed his brain's ability to command his own muscles. But as the altimeter unwinds with sickening speed, dropping through 10,000 feet, then 5,000, then 3, the primal human instinct for survival violently overrides the physiological paralysis. A massive surge of adrenaline floods his system. With the dark blue expanse of the ocean rushing up to fill his remaining field of vision, Sakai forces his right hand to move. His fingers lock rigidly around the control stick. He's fighting not only his own failing body, but the immense, crushing aerodynamic pressure of a high-speed dive. The flight control surfaces of the Zero are stiffening under the extreme velocity, requiring brutal physical strength to manipulate. Using solely his right arm, he begins to haul back on the control column. The airframe violently shudders. The wings flex under the sudden massive G-force load, compressing Sakai heavily into his canvas seat. Mere feet above the whitecaps, the nose of the Zero slowly begins to rise. The aircraft blasts over the ocean swells, kicking up a mist of salt spray in its wake before painfully leveling out. He has avoided immediate destruction, but his reality is profoundly grim. The aircraft is flying, but the pilot is critically compromised. The slipstream is a hurricane inside the cockpit, blasting him with freezing air and the sharp stench of aviation gas. He is hundreds of miles deep into hostile territory, completely alone and rapidly bleeding. The medical reality of his situation requires immediate clinical triage if he is to survive the next 10 minutes, let alone the next 4 hours. The trauma to his skull has caused a severe hemorrhage, and the pooling fluids are rapidly obscuring the vision in his functioning left eye. In the high-stakes environment of naval aviation, a pilot who cannot see his instrument panel is a dead man. Sakai desperately reaches for the standard-issue medical supplies stowed in the cockpit. Operating with only one functioning hand, he manages to extract the aviation bandages. The mechanical difficulty of applying pressure to a severe head wound while simultaneously trying to keep a wildly unstable, badly damaged fighter flying straight and level is nearly impossible. He attempts to forcefully stuff the bandages into the wound, using his flight helmet to clamp them down, but the sheer volume of the hemorrhage quickly overwhelms the rudimentary dressings. The fluids continue to pool, blinding his remaining eye. Faced with total visual deprivation, Sakai executes a brilliant, desperate aerodynamic maneuver. Recognizing that gravity is pulling the fluids directly down into his left eye, he realizes he must change his orientation to the earth. Gripping the stick, he forcefully applies right aileron and kicks the right rudder pedal. The Mitsubishi Zero violently snaps over, rolling onto its back. Sakai is now flying completely inverted, suspended upside down by his canvas lap belts, just hundreds of feet above the Pacific Ocean. The physical exertion of hanging inverted while enduring severe trauma is agonizing, but the radical solution works. Gravity immediately begins to drain the pooling fluids away from his functioning eye. His vision slowly clears. For the first time since the catastrophic impact, he can actually read his instrument dials. Hanging upside down, the rushing wind tearing at his flight suit, he quickly scans the crucial parameters. He memorizes the heading on his cracked magnetic compass. He checks the altimeter. Most importantly, he checks the fuel gauge. With the critical data locked in his mind, he rolls the aircraft upright again, gasping for air as the G-forces shift back to normal. Now, he faces a terrifying mathematical and geographic reality. He is roughly 560 miles away from the Japanese airfield at Rabaul. Under normal conditions, this is a grueling 3 to 4 hour transit with a damaged airframe, fluctuating engine temperatures, and a pilot drifting in and out of shock. It is a virtual impossibility. Furthermore, his navigational charts are gone, either soaked in the chaos or blown out of the shattered canopy. His compass housing is damaged, making the readings sluggish and unreliable. He is forced to abandon instrument navigation and rely entirely on the most primal methods of dead reckoning. He looks up at the sky. It is the middle of the afternoon. The glaring Pacific sun is beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon. Knowing that New Britain lies generally to the northwest, he uses the position of the sun to establish a base heading, angling the nose of the Zero slightly to the right of the glare. But heading alone will not save him. The absolute dictator of this flight is aviation gas. The Zero was famous for its incredible range, but Sakai has already spent hours flying to Guadalcanal, engaged in high-throttle combat maneuvers, and bled precious fuel during his uncontrolled dive. He reaches for the engine mixture control. To cover the immense distance, he must fly at the absolute maximum efficiency. He slowly pulls the lever back, leaning out the fuel-air mixture flowing into the carburetor. He pulls it until the massive Nakajima engine begins to violently cough and violently shudder, starved of combustible vapor, before inching the lever forward just a fraction of a millimeter to keep the cylinders firing. He is intentionally running the engine dangerously lean, trading mechanical safety and horsepower for a few extra miles of range. He drops his altitude, hugging the wave tops to stay under the radar horizons of any American task forces and to hide from the high-altitude combat air patrols of Grumman Wildcats. To navigate the vast, featureless void of the Solomon Sea, he uses the island chains as a massive geological breadcrumb trail. He spots the towering volcanic peaks of Bougainville, keeping them off his right wing. Hours pass. He navigates by the coastlines of Bucca and New Ireland, utilizing the dark green silhouettes of the jungle against the horizon to correct his drift. While Sakai wages a desperate, solitary war against human physiology and fuel consumption, the perspective shifts dramatically, thousands of feet above and dozens of miles behind him. The American strike package that delivered the crippling blow continues its mission, entirely unaware of the historical weight of the encounter. For the enlisted aviation radio men and rear gunners manning the twin 30 caliber mounts in the backs of the heavy carrier bombers, the engagement was a terrifying split-second blur. From their perspective, in the rear seats, a Japanese fighter had suddenly materialized out of the sun, diving directly into their overlapping fields of fire. Operating on sheer muscle memory and rigid tactical training, they had swung their heavy mounts, sighted the approaching Zero, and squeezed their triggers. The airframes had rattled with the recoil. The harsh smell of cordite filled their cockpits. They had watched their incendiary tracer rounds walk directly into the nose and canopy of the attacking aircraft. They had seen the glass shatter and pieces of aluminum shear off. And then, the Zero had simply dropped away, disappearing rapidly into the haze below. There is no wild celebration in the rear cockpits. There is only the grim, exhausted relief of survival. As the American formation eventually breaks off and begins its own long transit back to the United States Navy aircraft carriers operating in the area, the gunners prepare for the mandatory administrative routine of combat. Once the heavy bombers trap on the wooden flight decks and the engines are cut, the crews immediately report to the ship's intelligence officers for debriefing. In the cramped, artificially lit ready rooms deep inside the hull of the carrier, the events of that afternoon are reduced to cold, bureaucratic paperwork. The intelligence officers, smoking cigarettes and holding clipboards, ask for altitudes, headings, and enemy numbers. The gunners report the engagement clinically. A Zero made a rear approach. Defensive fire was concentrated. The enemy aircraft was hit in the canopy and broke off downward, out of control. The intelligence officers log it as one enemy fighter damaged, claiming a probable kill. It is a completely routine entry in the massive, chaotic ledger of the Guadalcanal campaign. The paperwork is filed away in a steel cabinet. The American military apparatus has absolutely no idea that those routine defensive bursts just neutralized the most dangerous living tactical aviator in the Imperial Japanese Navy. They do not know his name, they do not know his rank, and they certainly do not know that he is currently defying every known law of medical science just hundreds of miles away. Back in the crippled Zero, the third hour of the flight slowly grinds away, and Sakai begins to fundamentally break down. The initial surge of adrenaline that saved him during the plunge has completely evaporated. The physiological debt of his massive trauma is finally being called in. The freezing temperatures at altitude, combined with severe blood loss, push him deep into medical shock. His core temperature plummets. His remaining vision begins to narrow into a dark tunnel. He catches his head violently slumping forward, his chin hitting his chest as he loses consciousness. He is entirely asleep at the controls. He wakes up seconds later in sheer terror as the aerodynamic pitch of the aircraft changes, the nose dropping dangerously toward the water. He forcefully shakes his head, screaming at himself over the roar of the radial engine, desperately trying to keep his mind tethered to reality. The physical pain is now a crushing, all-encompassing weight. It is here, in the darkest, most agonizing hour of the flight, that Sakai faces a profound psychological crisis. He is a product of the Imperial Japanese Navy, an institution that rigorously drills a highly militarized interpretation of the Bushido Code into its officers and aviators. The doctrine dictates that there is absolutely no honor in surviving a defeat, no dignity in being captured, and certainly no glory in dying a useless, quiet death by ditching into the ocean. The pain is so severe and the exhaustion so absolute that the temptation of a quick, honorable end becomes overwhelming. He makes a conscious, deliberate, tactical decision to die, but he refuses to simply fall out of the sky. He wants to take the enemy with him. Fighting back waves of darkness, Sakai actively begins to scan the vast expanse of the ocean, searching for the wake of an Allied warship. He intends to use his remaining fuel to execute a terminal dive, driving his shattered fighter directly into the bridge of an American destroyer or cruiser in a final devastating act of defiance. He stares at the horizon, willing a gray hull to appear on the water. But the Pacific is agonizingly empty. There are no convoys. There are no task forces. Denied a warrior's death, and with nowhere to crash but the empty sea, he is forced back into the excruciating reality of survival. He has no choice but to keep flying. As the flight bleeds into its fourth hour, the fuel gauge needle bounces erratically near the empty mark. The engine begins to occasionally sputter, starved of vapor. But then, breaking through the coastal haze, a massive, jagged silhouette appears on the horizon. It is the smoking volcanic caldera surrounding Rabaul. He has reached the island of New Britain. He has navigated over 500 miles of open ocean, relying on the sun, the islands, and sheer intuition, all while suffering catastrophic cranial trauma. But the hardest, most technically demanding phase of the flight still remains. He must land a high-performance fighter aircraft. He approaches the dusty, uneven strip of the Lakunai airfield. As he enters the landing pattern, the true severity of his optical injury becomes a terrifying mechanical liability. Without his right eye, Sakai has zero depth perception. He cannot accurately judge distance. He cannot tell if the ground is 100 feet below his landing gear or 10 feet. The visual cues required to safely flare an aircraft are completely gone. He is forced to artificially gauge his altitude by comparing the size of the palm trees and the maintenance hangars on the perimeter of the field. He manually cranks down the landing gear, praying the hydraulic lines were not severed in the attack. The green lock lights illuminate. He pulls back the throttle, and the heavy fighter begins to sink toward the dirt. Operating purely on thousands of hours of ingrained muscle memory, he pulls back the stick at what he hopes is the correct moment. The Zero drops hard. The tires violently strike the rough dirt runway, the airframe bouncing aggressively, but the struts hold. The aircraft rolls through the dust, the propellers slowly ticking to a halt as the engine finally consumes the absolute last drops of aviation gas. As the Zero comes to a rest, the airfield ground crews sprint toward the shattered aircraft. Seeing the blown-out canopy and the state of the cockpit, they fully expect to be recovering a corpse. But what happens next permanently defines his legacy. The rigid military discipline ingrained in him violently overrides his failing biology. As the mechanics reach up to pull him from the seat, Sakai aggressively waves them off. He refuses to be carried. He forces his paralyzed left leg to move. He hauls his battered body out of the cockpit, drops down onto the wing, and slowly lowers himself to the dirt. Bleeding, half-blind, and operating on the absolute extreme edge of human endurance, he forces himself to stand rigidly at attention. He demands to see his commanding officer. Only when his superior arrives and Sakai delivers a formal, strained after-action report regarding the engagement over Guadalcanal does the sheer force of his will finally snap. His duty fulfilled, the adrenaline completely evaporates, and he collapses unconscious into the volcanic dust. He had survived the impossible, cementing his status as a living legend within the Japanese military. But the true identity of the American men who put him in that cockpit remained buried in the classified filing cabinets of the United States Navy, quietly waiting to be unearthed decades later. For decades after the war, the narrative of that brutal encounter over the Solomon Islands seemed neatly resolved. As classified documents were declassified and memoirs were published, researchers and historians eagerly attempted to connect the dots of the chaotic air battle. Eventually, the historical consensus locked onto a specific name, Harold Jones, an American rear gunner who had fired on an attacking Zero that exact same afternoon. This conclusion birthed one of the most compelling human interest stories of the post-war era. In a highly publicized event, Saburo Sakai traveled to the United States to meet the man widely believed to have nearly killed him. The resulting reunion was intensely emotional. The two former enemies, once locked in a lethal, high-altitude duel, openly embraced. It was a powerful, cinematic narrative of forgiveness and reconciliation, broadcast to the world as the ultimate closure to a bitter conflict. But memory, especially memory forged in the extreme trauma of combat, is inherently fragile. When a new generation of aviation historians began to meticulously cross-reference the original handwritten combat logs from August 7th, the emotional reunion collided with cold, unforgiving archival facts. By plotting the precise navigational coordinates, altitudes, and timestamps of every American bomber squadron operating over Guadalcanal that afternoon, researchers uncovered a glaring mechanical discrepancy. Harold Jones was indeed manning a rear machine gun in a Douglas SBD Dauntless that day. He did fire on a Japanese fighter, but his squadron's documented altitude and time over the target area simply do not intersect with Sakai's established flight path. The geometry of the sky does not align. According to the raw tactical data, Jones was miles away from Sakai's position, likely engaging a completely different section of Zeros. The revelation creates a profound historical dissonance. The documentation strongly indicates that Harold Jones could not have been the shooter. Yet the emotional weight of their post-war embrace remains absolutely real. It forces us to confront a deeply unsettling aspect of military history. How could two seasoned veterans, men who had stared directly into the terrifying reality of war, become so entirely convinced of a shared, intimate moment of violence that likely never happened? The answer lies not in deliberate deception, but in the chaotic, disorienting fog of aerial warfare, a fog that can drift long past the end of a conflict, reshaping memories to find closure where the archives offer only sterile, fragmented data. To truly understand this desperate need for closure, you must strip away the clinical perspective of modern historical research and place yourself back inside the terrifying reality of that August afternoon. Air combat over the Solomon Islands was not a structured, geometric duel. It was a blinding, three-dimensional melee occurring at over 300 miles per hour. Dozens of aircraft from multiple American squadrons violently maneuvered through heavy clouds and intense tropical glare. Individual engagements lasted only seconds. A Japanese Zero diving out of the sun was a fleeting silhouette. American rear gunners fired thousands of rounds in overlapping defensive arcs, creating an indiscriminate web of lethal crossfire. When an attacking fighter broke away trailing debris, there was rarely time to confirm the kill. The crews immediately had to scan the sky for the next threat. In this high-speed furball, definitively linking one specific bullet to one specific aircraft is historically impossible. The hard reality of the archives is that the man who shattered Saburo Sakai's cockpit was almost certainly not Harold Jones. The real shooter was likely an anonymous, exhausted aviation radio man in a completely different formation. He tracked a diving target, squeezed his triggers, watched his rounds strike home, and braced for the next attack. He reported a damaged enemy fighter, and his brief report was swallowed by the massive administrative machinery of the Pacific Fleet. The harshest truth of the Guadalcanal campaign is that this anonymous gunner likely never knew what he had achieved. The attrition rate for American carrier bomber crews in the autumn of 1942 was catastrophic. The young man who inadvertently ended the combat career of the greatest living Japanese ace may have very well been shot down days later at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons or Santa Cruz, his identity lost forever to the depths of the Pacific Ocean. This stark realization does not diminish the profound post-war encounter between Sakai and Jones. Instead, it elevates their meeting into a complex testament to the psychological aftermath of combat. War inflicts trauma that raw data and flight logs can never fully quantify. For veterans who survive the unimaginable, the sterile ambiguity of the archives is often insufficient. There is a fundamental human need to assign a face to the faceless enemy, to find order and resolution in an environment defined by sudden, random violence. Harold Jones believed he shot Saburo Sakai because he needed to make sense of the chaos he survived. Saburo Sakai embraced Harold Jones because he needed to look into the eyes of the force that had violently altered his life and forgive it. They were two men clinging to a shared narrative because the alternative, that their defining moment was just an anonymous, random collision of metal and ballistics, was simply too cold to bear. The myth they created together became a necessary psychological bridge, allowing them to finally leave the war behind. Crossing that psychological bridge ultimately took much longer than the grueling transit across the Solomon Sea. The astonishing 4-hour flight from Guadalcanal to Rabaul remains one of the ultimate testaments to human endurance in the history of aviation. But the physical act of coaxing a shattered Mitsubishi Zero across 500 miles of open ocean was only the first half of Saburo Sakai's survival. Withstanding the sudden, violent impact of a .30 caliber bullet demanded absolute biological willpower. Surviving the memory of the war required a completely different, decades-long kind of dead reckoning navigation. For decades, the true cost of the Pacific theater was measured in tonnage sunk, aircraft destroyed, and islands captured. Yet the deeply human reconciliation between a Japanese fighter ace and an American tail gunner reveals a hidden, lingering metric of the conflict. The fact that the original combat logs and squadron timestamps firmly dismantle their shared story is entirely secondary to the reality of their embrace. Historical archives perfectly preserve the cold mechanics of battle. They faithfully record altitudes, headings, and ammunition expended, but they cannot quantify the sheer psychological weight carried by the men who survived the meat grinder of aerial combat. To truly heal from the massive industrialized trauma of the Second World War, These aging veterans could not simply make peace with an abstract nation or a faceless, distant military machine. They desperately needed a specific human being to look in the eye. They needed a concrete individual to forgive, and someone to be forgiven by. In the absence of a confirmed archival identity, Harold Jones and Saburo Sakai essentially adopted one another to fulfill that profound emotional necessity. They bypassed the sterile, terrifying reality of anonymous ballistics to forge their own truth. It is a striking reminder that, while the war was fought with cutting-edge engineering and brutal tactical doctrine, it was ultimately survived by fragile human beings desperately trying to find their way back home. In the vast, unforgiving skies of the Pacific, the .30 caliber bullet that permanently blinded Saburo Sakai was ultimately fired by an anonymous hand. We will likely never know the actual name of the American gunner who pulled the trigger over Guadalcanal that afternoon, just as that young enlisted radio man almost certainly never realized he had brought down the most lethal fighter pilot in the Japanese Navy. But the profound peace Sakai found decades later was undeniably real. He survived an impossible, agonizing flight across a featureless ocean, only to discover that the final, most difficult navigation of his entire life was simply finding the grace to forgive the wrong man.